16-year-old Cameron Hayes walked into the courtroom with the swagger of someone who believed he had discovered a legal loophole that made him untouchable. His baby face, still marked by the remnants of adolescent acne, was arranged in a slight, knowing smirk as he took his seat at the defense table. Throughout the preliminary hearings, he had exhibited the same infuriating confidence, doodling elaborate drawings of guns on his legal notepad, whispering casual comments to his attorney, occasionally glancing at the victim's family with an expression that bordered on amusement. He had been charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony, but Cameron seemed utterly unconcerned. In his mind, he had done the math. He was 16. He was a minor. The juvenile justice system would protect him. He would spend a few years in a youth facility, get released at 21 with his record sealed, and walk away from a murder charge with his entire life ahead of him. It was, he believed, the perfect crime committed at the perfect age. What Cameron didn't know, what his arrogance and his shallow understanding of the law had prevented him from fully grasping, was that the prosecution had evidence that would prove he had made these exact calculations before pulling the trigger. His own internet search history was about to become the weapon that destroyed his defense and ensured he would be tried as an adult, facing life in prison for a murder he committed with cold, calculated premeditation. The murder that brought Cameron Hayes into that courtroom occurred on a cold November night in suburban Detroit, Michigan. The victim was 43-year-old Marcus Thompson, a small business owner who ran a successful auto repair shop and lived a quiet life with his wife and 2 teenage daughters. Marcus was not involved in criminal activity, had no gang affiliations, and, by all accounts, was a decent man who paid his bills, supported his family, and contributed to his community. He was also, unfortunately, the target of a murder-for-hire plot orchestrated by his business partner, Robert Chen, who had been systematically embezzling money from their shared business and feared that Marcus was about to discover the theft. Chen needed Marcus dead before an upcoming audit could reveal his crimes, and he was willing to pay to make that happen. But Chen was not a violent man himself, and he had no connections to professional criminals or organized crime. What he did have was a gambling problem that brought him into contact with Jamie Cortez, a low-level drug dealer who operated on the fringes of Detroit's criminal underworld. Chen approached Cortez with a proposal, $15,000 to arrange Marcus Thompson's death, make it look like a robbery, and ensure it happened before the end of the month. Cortez accepted the job, but had no intention of doing it himself. Instead, he began looking for someone desperate and stupid enough to commit murder for a fraction of the money Chen was paying. That's when he thought of Cameron Hayes, a 16-year-old who hung around Cortez's neighborhood, trying to project an image of toughness and street credibility that his suburban upbringing and intact family completely contradicted. Cameron was not a hardened criminal. He was a middle-class teenager who had fallen in love with the aesthetics of gang culture. Through rap music and social media, someone who wore the costume but had never faced real consequences. He had a juvenile record, shoplifting, vandalism, possession of marijuana, but nothing violent, nothing that suggested he was capable of murder. Cortez saw not a hardened killer, but a naive kid who could be manipulated, who wanted to prove himself, and most importantly, who was a minor, and therefore theoretically insulated from the harshest consequences of the adult criminal justice system. Cortez approached Cameron with the job, offering him $3,000 to kill a man he had never met. And Cameron, after thinking about it for less than 24 hours, said yes. But Cameron didn't say yes impulsively. He said yes after conducting research. In the week before he committed the murder, Cameron's internet search history revealed a chilling pattern of deliberation and calculation. He searched, what happens if a minor commits murder? Can 16-year-old be tried as adult? Juvenile versus adult murder charges. What age can you go to adult prison? And dozens of similar queries. He spent hours reading legal websites, forums, and news articles about juveniles charged with serious crimes. He researched specific cases where teenagers had been tried as adults and cases where they hadn't, trying to understand the factors that determined which system would handle the case. And what his research told him, or what he wanted to believe it told him, was that he could get away with it. He read about cases where juveniles were given lenient sentences, where records were sealed, where young offenders were released in their early 20s to start fresh. He convinced himself that his age was a shield, that the system would see him as a child who made a mistake, rather than as a killer who made a choice. Armed with this false confidence, Cameron agreed to murder Marcus Thompson for $3,000 and the prospect of street credibility. Cortez provided Cameron with the details: Marcus Thompson's address, his schedule, his physical description, and a stolen .38 caliber revolver. Cortez told Cameron to make it look like a robbery, to take Marcus's wallet and phone, and to do it when Marcus was alone. Cameron took the gun, studied the information, and began his own surveillance. For 3 days he watched Marcus's home, noting when he arrived, when he left, when his wife and daughters were present. He planned the attack with a level of detail that belied his claim of being just a dumb kid. On November 8th, Cameron saw his opportunity. Marcus's wife had taken their daughters to a school event, and Marcus was home alone, working in his garage on a project car. At 8:47 p.m., Cameron approached the house on foot, wearing a dark hoodie and gloves. He walked up the driveway as if he belonged there. And when Marcus looked up from his work, Cameron pulled the gun and fired 3 times at close range. 2 bullets struck Marcus in the chest, and 1 struck him in the head. Marcus died instantly, collapsing onto the concrete garage floor. Cameron stood over the body for a moment, then took Marcus's wallet and phone as instructed, and walked away. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply left, as if he had just completed an errand. The 911 call came from a neighbor who heard the gunshots and saw a young male walking away from the Thompson residence. Police arrived within minutes to find Marcus dead in his garage, the murder weapon nowhere to be found, and no immediate suspects. Marcus's wife returned home to find her husband's body, and her life shattered. The investigation began immediately, with detectives from the Detroit Police Department's homicide unit canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses and security camera footage. What they found was a trail of evidence that would lead directly to Cameron Hayes within 72 hours. A neighbor's doorbell camera had captured a clear image of Cameron walking toward the Thompson house, his face visible despite the hoodie. Another camera caught him walking away, and the timestamps corresponded perfectly with the time of the shooting. License plate readers captured a vehicle that Cameron had borrowed from a friend parked 2 blocks away. The investigation quickly identified Cameron, pulled his juvenile record, and obtained warrants for his arrest and for his electronic devices. When detectives executed the warrant at Cameron's home, his parents were shocked and disbelieving. Cameron was in his bedroom playing video games when police arrived, and he seemed surprised but not particularly concerned about his arrest. "I didn't do anything," he said, his tone more annoyed than afraid. "You can't prove anything." But the detectives already had enough to charge him: the video evidence, the ballistics that would later match the bullets recovered from Marcus's body to the gun that Cortez had provided, and witness statements placing Cameron in the area. What detectives found when they searched Cameron's phone and laptop would transform the case from a murder charge to a murder charge with premeditation and special circumstances. Cameron's search history was a roadmap of his decision-making process, showing clearly that he had researched the legal consequences of murder as a minor, had understood the risks, and had decided to proceed anyway because he believed his age would protect him. Even more damning, detectives found text messages between Cameron and Cortez discussing the job, including messages where Cameron explicitly asked, "What happens if I get caught? I'm 16, so I can't go to real prison, right?" Cortez's response was chilling in its manipulation. "You're good. Worst case juvie till you're 21. Then you're free and rich." The case was assigned to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, where Assistant Prosecutor Diana Foster immediately recognized the significance of the search history evidence. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of reckless stupidity. This was premeditated murder committed by someone who had calculated the risks and decided the benefits outweighed the consequences. Foster filed a motion to have Cameron tried as an adult, citing the severity of the crime, the level of premeditation, the use of a firearm, and most importantly, The evidence that Cameron had specifically researched whether he could be tried as an adult and had proceeded with the murder anyway. This defendant cannot claim he didn't understand what he was doing, Foster wrote in her motion. He researched it extensively. He knew the consequences. He made an informed choice to commit murder, betting that his age would shield him from justice. He was wrong. The hearing to determine whether Cameron would be tried as an adult or remain in the juvenile system was the most important legal proceeding of his young life, and he didn't seem to understand that at all. Cameron's attorney, Martin Reeves, was a public defender with extensive experience in juvenile cases. Reeves was a passionate advocate for young offenders, someone who genuinely believed that children, even those who committed serious crimes, deserved a chance at rehabilitation rather than life sentences. But even Reeves was disturbed by his client's behavior and the evidence against him. In their initial meetings, Cameron showed no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of what he had done. He talked about the murder casually, referring to it as the job, or that situation, as if it were a business transaction rather than the ending of a human life. He was more concerned with whether his friends thought he was cool than with the fact that he had left 2 teenage girls without a father. Reeves tried to explain the seriousness of the transfer hearing, tried to make Cameron understand that if he was certified as an adult, he would be facing life in prison without parole. But Cameron just smirked and said, "They can't do that. I'm 16. His confidence was unshakable and completely unfounded. The certification hearing took place over 2 days in front of Judge Harold Mitchell, a stern jurist who had presided over juvenile court for 20 years and had seen every type of case imaginable. The courtroom was packed with Marcus Thompson's family, members of the community, and media covering a case that had captured public attention. Cameron entered wearing the collared shirt and dress pants that Reeves had insisted on, but his demeanor undermined any attempt to make him look sympathetic. He slouched in his chair, occasionally glanced at his phone until the bailiff confiscated it, and wore that same slight smirk that suggested he still didn't take the proceedings seriously. Prosecutor Foster presented her case methodically, calling witnesses who testified about the brutality of the crime, the impact on Marcus Thompson's family, and Cameron's complete lack of remorse. She presented the surveillance footage showing Cameron calmly walking to and from the murder scene. She presented the text messages showing Cameron's agreement to commit the murder for money. And then she presented the search history. The courtroom fell silent as Foster walked through Cameron's Google searches, displayed on a large screen for everyone to see. What happens if a minor commits murder? Searched November 1st, 7 days before the murder. Can 16-year-old be tried as adult Michigan? Searched November 2nd, juvenile. Murder sentence versus adult. Searched November 3rd, what age juvenile record sealed? Searched November 4th. The searches continued right up until the night before the murder, showing a clear pattern of research, evaluation, and decision-making. Foster paused after each search, letting the implications sink in. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and firm, the defense will argue that Cameron Hayes is a child who made a terrible mistake. But this evidence shows us a young man who researched the consequences of murder, who understood the difference between juvenile and adult prosecution, who calculated the risks, and who decided to kill Marcus Thompson anyway, because he believed his age would protect him from serious punishment. That is not a child. That is a calculating killer who weaponized his youth. Reeves's defense was passionate, but ultimately inadequate against the weight of the evidence. He called a psychologist who testified that Cameron's brain was not fully developed, that teenagers are prone to impulsive decisions and peer pressure, and that the juvenile system was designed specifically for cases like this. He presented Cameron's clean record before this incident, his intact family support system, and his potential for rehabilitation. He argued that the entire purpose of the juvenile justice system was to recognize that children make mistakes and deserve second chances. But Foster's cross-examination was devastating. She got the psychologist to admit that the search history showed planning and deliberation, not impulsivity. She forced him to acknowledge that researching the legal consequences of an action before committing it demonstrated an understanding of right and wrong, and she pointed out that Cameron had not been pressured or coerced. He had volunteered for the job after understanding what it entailed. Throughout all of this testimony, Cameron sat doodling on his legal pad, drawing elaborate firearms with detailed grips and barrels, his pencil moving across the paper with the focus of someone who was bored and looking for a distraction. Several times, Judge Mitchell had to tell Cameron to pay attention and put the pen down. The optics were terrible. A teenager on trial for murder by firearm, drawing pictures of guns while his victim's family sat 20 feet away. Judge Mitchell took 2 days to deliberate before issuing his ruling. When court reconvened, his expression was grave. He addressed Cameron directly, something that made the teenager finally look up from his doodling with a flicker of concern. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Mitchell began, "I have reviewed all of the evidence presented in this hearing. I have considered your age, your family circumstances, your potential for rehabilitation. I have also considered the nature of the crime you are accused of committing, the cold-blooded murder of an innocent man for money. But what weighs most heavily on my decision is the evidence of your internet searches." He paused, looking directly at Cameron. "You researched whether you could be tried as an adult. You researched the differences between juvenile and adult sentences. You educated yourself on the potential consequences of murder, and then you made a conscious, calculated decision to proceed anyway because you believed your age would shield you from serious punishment. That demonstrates a level of premeditation and sophistication that is incompatible with treatment in the juvenile system." Judge Mitchell's voice grew harder. "You have shown this court, through your actions and your behavior, that you are not a child who made a mistake. You are someone who planned and executed a murder with full knowledge of what you were doing. Therefore, I am granting the prosecution's motion. You will be tried as an adult in the Wayne County Circuit Court on charges of first-degree murder. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court will not." Cameron's smirk finally disappeared. His face went pale, his mouth opened slightly, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. Reeves put a hand on his shoulder, but Cameron shrugged it off, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The shield of youth he had counted on had just been stripped away, and the reality of life in prison was beginning to penetrate his consciousness. Marcus Thompson's widow, Patricia, sat in the front row with her daughters and allowed herself a small, grim nod of satisfaction. It wasn't justice yet, but it was a step toward it. The trial in adult court began 4 months later, and if Cameron had been arrogant before the certification hearing, he was subdued afterward, though not repentant. He no longer smirked openly, but his demeanor remained detached, as if he were watching events unfold to someone else, rather than accepting that he was the protagonist of this tragedy. The jury was seated, a diverse panel of 12 citizens who would decide whether this now 17-year-old would spend the rest of his life in prison. Prosecutor Foster's opening statement was a masterwork of narrative construction. She told the story of Marcus Thompson's life, his family, his business, his orderly existence that was shattered by a stranger hired to kill him for money. She described Cameron not as a child, but as a hired killer who had researched his crime, planned his attack, executed it with cold efficiency, and then attempted to hide behind his age. She promised the jury they would see the evidence of Cameron's search history, his text messages, his surveillance of the victim, and his complete lack of remorse. Reeves's opening statement was more subdued than his certification hearing arguments. He knew the adult jury would be less sympathetic to claims of youth and immaturity, so he focused instead on the manipulative adults who had used Cameron, Robert Chen, who had orchestrated the murder plot, and Jamie Cortez, who had recruited and equipped a teenager to do his dirty work. Reeves portrayed Cameron as a victim of exploitation, a naive kid who had been taken advantage of by cynical criminals. It was a reasonable strategy, but it required Cameron to look like a victim, and his courtroom behavior continued to undermine that narrative. He no longer drew guns on his notepad. Reeves had confiscated all pens and pencils, but he fidgeted, stared into space, and showed no visible emotion during testimony about the devastation his actions had caused. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Foster presented the surveillance footage, the ballistics evidence linking Cameron to the murder weapon, and the testimony of witnesses who placed him at the scene. She called Patricia Thompson to the stand, and the widow's testimony about the moment she found her husband's body, about explaining to her daughters that their father was dead, about the financial and emotional devastation that followed, was heartbreaking and powerful. Throughout Patricia's testimony, Cameron stared at the defense table, his face expressionless, showing none of the empathy or remorse that might have softened the jury's perception of him. When Foster asked Patricia how Marcus's death had affected their family, Patricia looked directly at Cameron and said, "He took everything from us. And he did it for money, $3,000. That's what my husband's life was worth to him." Several jurors followed her gaze to Cameron, who still showed no reaction, cementing in their minds the image of a cold, calculating killer rather than a misguided child. But the most damaging testimony came when Foster presented the digital evidence. Forensic computer analysts took the stand and walked the jury through Cameron's search history in excruciating detail. Each search was displayed on a large screen, along with the date and time it was conducted. The jury watched as the searches progressed from general inquiries about juvenile justice to specific questions about murder charges and sentencing. Foster asked the analyst to explain what the searches revealed about Cameron's state of mind. "These searches show a pattern of research and decision-making," the analyst testified. "The defendant was not acting impulsively. He was gathering information to assess the risks and consequences of his actions. He was specifically interested in whether being a minor would protect him from adult prosecution and sentencing. Based on the timeline, he conducted this research, evaluated the information, and then proceeded with the murder." Foster then displayed the text messages between Cameron and Cortez, including the exchange where Cameron asked about the consequences of getting caught, and Cortez assured him that he would only face juvenile detention until age 21. The prosecution's presentation of this evidence took nearly 2 hours, and by the end, the jury had seen irrefutable proof that Cameron Hayes had not stumbled into murder through immaturity or manipulation. He had researched it, planned it, and executed it with the calculated mindset of someone who believed he had found a loophole in the justice system. Foster's direct examination of the analyst ended with a simple question. "In your professional opinion, do these searches indicate that the defendant understood what he was doing when he committed this murder?" The analyst nodded. "Absolutely. These searches show clear understanding and premeditation." When Foster returned to her seat, she glanced at Cameron, whose face had gone pale as he watched his own search history displayed for the jury. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his age wasn't going to save him. It was going to be used against him to prove his guilt. The defense's case was brief and unconvincing. Reeves called Cameron's parents, who testified tearfully that their son had fallen in with a bad crowd, that they didn't know what he was capable of, and that they still believed in his potential for rehabilitation. It was sympathetic testimony, but it did nothing to counter the mountain of evidence against Cameron. Reeves called a gang expert who testified about how young people are recruited and manipulated by criminal organizations, trying to paint Cameron as a victim of Cortez's exploitation. But on cross-examination, Foster dismantled this narrative by pointing out that Cameron had sought out Cortez's world, not the other way around, and that the search history proved Cameron had made an informed decision, rather than being coerced. Reeves wisely did not put Cameron on the stand. His lack of remorse and his inability to express empathy would have been catastrophic to his defense. The closing arguments crystallized the case. Foster reminded the jury of Marcus Thompson's life and death, of Patricia and her daughters, and of the cold, calculating nature of Cameron's actions. She walked through the evidence one final time. The surveillance footage, the text messages, the search history. "The defense wants you to see Cameron Hayes as a child," Foster said, her voice strong. "But children don't research the legal consequences of murder before committing it. Children don't plan surveillance operations. Children don't execute another human being for money and then show no remorse. Cameron Hayes made an adult decision to commit an adult crime with full knowledge of what he was doing. And you saw the proof, his own searches, his own words, his own actions. He knew exactly what he was doing. and now he must face adult consequences. Reeves's closing was an appeal to mercy and proportionality. He acknowledged Cameron's guilt, but argued that a life sentence for a 16-year-old was cruel and unusual, that the entire point of having a separate juvenile justice system was to recognize that young people's brains are different, their judgment impaired, their capacity for change real. He asked the jury to consider that Cameron could still be rehabilitated, that throwing away a young life served no purpose, that mercy and justice were not mutually exclusive. It was a well-delivered argument, but it felt hollow in the face of the evidence and Cameron's continued inability to demonstrate the remorse that might have made the jury believe in his capacity for genuine. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. When they returned, their faces showed the weight of what they had decided. The foreman stood and delivered guilty verdicts on all counts: first-degree murder with premeditation, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony firearm. Cameron's face crumbled. The confidence, the detachment, the belief that his age would somehow save him, it all shattered in that moment. He began to cry, not the performative tears of someone playing to an audience, but the broken, desperate crying of someone who had finally, devastatingly, realized the permanence of his situation. Patricia Thompson closed her eyes and let tears stream down her face, her daughters on either side of her, holding her hands. It was a guilty verdict, but it wouldn't bring Marcus back. It was justice, but it was cold comfort. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later was Cameron's final opportunity to address the court, and for the first time, he stood and spoke words that seemed to come from genuine remorse rather than calculation. "I know I can't take back what I did," he said, his voice shaking. "I know I destroyed a family. I know I'm a murderer. I was stupid and arrogant, and I thought I could get away with it because I was 16. I was wrong about everything. I'm sorry." It was the first time he had apologized, the first time he had acknowledged the full weight of his actions, but it came far too late. Judge Sarah Daniels, who had presided over the trial with stern professionalism, addressed Cameron directly before sentencing. "Mr. Hayes, you stood before this court as a 16-year-old who committed one of the most calculated murders I have seen in my career. You researched the consequences. You planned the attack. You executed an innocent man. And then you tried to hide behind your age, believing that youth would shield you from justice." Judge Daniels' voice grew harder. "But your own searches proved what you already knew, that you could be tried as an adult. You gambled that you wouldn't be. You lost that gamble, and now you must face the consequences of your actions." She sentenced him to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence in Michigan for first-degree murder. As the sentence was read, Cameron collapsed into his chair, his body shaking with sobs. His parents cried out from the gallery, his mother's wails of grief echoing through the courtroom. But Patricia Thompson sat quietly, her face composed, and when Cameron was led away in chains, still crying, still begging for mercy that would not come, she whispered to her daughters, "Your father's life mattered. This proves it." The teenage hitman who had smirked his way through preliminary hearings, who had drawn guns on his notepad while Marcus Thompson's family grieved, who had believed his youth made him untouchable, would spend the rest of his life in an adult prison, learning the lesson he should have understood from the beginning. Actions have consequences, and no amount of research can change that fundamental truth when you choose to take a human life.